Welcome to Beyond the Surface. On our podcast, we highlight underrepresented voices in architecture. We'll humanize architects by uncovering who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez, representing the Illinois Tech student chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects. Today's episode is called Developing History with our guest, Ann Thompson. Ann Thompson, FAIA, is Executive Vice President of Architecture and Design at Related Midwest. In her role, Ann directs the work of architecture, urban planning, interior design, and engineering to oversee the design and community vision for Related Midwest projects. She leads the design and planning of projects across the company's portfolio of mixed-use, mixed-income, affordable, and luxury developments, as well as all engineering, zoning, and entitlement efforts. Ann is a licensed architect in Illinois and serves as a trustee of the Chicago Architecture Center and the Alliance Francaise de Chicago. In addition, she is on the advisory board for the Illinois Institute of Technology College of Architecture and for the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign School of Architecture, where she received her Master of Architecture. Her work has been acknowledged by Forbes, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. She was named to Crain's Chicago Business, Notable Women in Construction and Design, and Notable Nonprofit Board Leaders. In 2024, she was named as AIA Fellow. Thank you for being here with us today. It's an honor to be able to interview you. We've heard a lot of the work that you do. You're very involved in the community, so I'm excited to have this conversation.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So why don't we get started? Can you talk about your background and how that influenced your identity?
Definitely. So I grew up in central Illinois in a small town as the oldest daughter in a big Catholic family. And I often talk about this because I think a lot of the skills that have helped me in my career, I learned through the early part of my life. When I was 10, I started working in my father's office. And a lot of the lessons I learned about communication, about how to handle people, I learned through that experience. And just by observing the way that my dad ran his business really shaped who I am as a professional today. I also think growing up in a small town, in a small environment, I went to an all-girls Catholic high school. And that gave me a place to sort of build some of those communication skills and things that have been important as I've moved into my career. So I think back on my childhood very nostalgically because I think a lot of the foundation that I needed for my career, I really gained through where I grew up in the kind of family that I grew up in is where I captured a lot of that.
I feel like a lot of your character came from how you grew up. And some of the things that you were saying, you talked about being able to learn from everything and learn from your parents and in a way that almost made you like a little entrepreneur in a way. You started to be able to read people and understand people a little bit better. So I know that you started in architecture. So can you talk about when did you become interested in architecture?
Great question. I think you're right. And I can't emphasize enough how much you learn from those early years and from your family and your experience with your family and how those lessons sort of carry with you. And like I said, it's sort of the foundation of who you become, not just as an architect, but as a citizen, as a professional. And it's interesting because I grew up in this small town where there wasn't a lot of architecture with a capital A. I didn't know any architects. And I hadn't really thought about becoming an architect until two things happened in high school. One, somebody strangely, for a birthday gift, gave a Tom Wolfe book about architecture, From Bauhaus to Our House. And it piqued my curiosity about, like, what is this all about? And I started doing some research about what architects do. And through that research, I realized it might be a unique way for me to exercise all the things that I like to do. I've never been a person who has a sort of singular focus. From a very early age, I liked doing lots of things. I was very intellectually curious. I simultaneously liked art and I liked math and I liked creative writing. And when I was thinking about college and thinking about some kind of career path, it was very difficult for me to say, I want to do this one thing because I knew I liked to do all these things. And so when I started investigating what architects do, it became very clear that you got to exercise all of those parts of your brain and your person. And for me, that was super interesting. And so I think I chose architecture when I was applying to colleges. I applied to architecture programs, probably not fully understanding everything that architects do, but really intrigued by this idea that you could sort of utilize all parts of your brain in that way. In the early days of my college career, you start to really understand what that means and how to apply it. And then, you learn more about the ways architects shape the built environment and all the ways that architects work in the building ecosystem. And that only kind of furthered my interest and sort of solidified the idea that I'm on the right path.
I do find it interesting that many people who go into architecture usually go in because their parents did something in architecture, or they were surrounded by really beautiful architecture. They saw it a lot as a kid. And in a way, I can relate to the fact that you didn't see that much architecture. It started from a book that piqued your interest. You had so many things that you wanted to do, so many things you were interested in. So once you started college, how did you see everything start coming together?
Good question. So as you mentioned, I went to University of Illinois, and that was sort of serendipitous for me because it is a program that gives you a sort of well-rounded perspective of architecture. We take a lot of structures, we take practice, but there is also a lot of design. And so I had the opportunity to see all those different aspects of architecture, but where I really put my focus was in design, which a lot of people might not think because I have evolved into a career in development. But the truth is, my singular focus in architecture school was about design. I was intrigued by the theories around design. I was intrigued the ways in which architecture kind of fell into a larger artistic movements, and that was very interesting. I have a longstanding interest in art, in history, and how architecture falls into that sort of cultural past was very interesting to me, and how it influenced design moving forward. I also love to travel, and that is something I was able to start to do when I was in college. We did not do a lot of traveling in my childhood, but I really wanted to travel internationally. And so while I wasn't exposed to architecture kind of in my childhood, so to speak, I did see, especially European cities, that were very intriguing to me in terms of not just sort of historic architecture, but how contemporary architecture was sort of reshaping those built environments. And so as I moved through the curriculum at Illinois, my focus really became very strong in design. I stayed at Illinois for my master's and did a design thesis. In graduate school, I really started to focus not so much on singular buildings, but really started to develop a focus more on larger urban gestures, which was interesting for somebody who didn't grow up in a city. But I was really intrigued as much about the urban environment as I was singular buildings. And in fact, my design thesis, which most people won't know about, I developed a project around an urban cemetery in Chicago. And it was more about a kind of urban context, and it was coming to terms with this idea of aging and how our cultural values around aging can be embodied in architecture and how we can challenge notions of aging and death. Through the course of my career, as I said, I was really intrigued always by design, although I had this sort of practical sensibility of wanting to understand structures and business and things. That focus really started to shift towards a more urban sensibility as I moved through my career, which I think is something that consciously or subconsciously probably is what intrigued me about moving towards development and the role that I'm in today.
I like the way you described urbanism or the urban environment, how you started seeing architecture as this small organism that works in the urban environment. And you really became interested in the history aspect and how architecture can shape history, how it can shape a city and shape even life, past, present, and future when you talked about death and life. I was listening when you talked about alternative careers at IIT. You talked about how in development you see things more as a whole. You kind of see the entire process of a building and how that ends up shaping what's around it. So I think that's interesting. But before we get too much in development, can you talk about what some of your early career was like?
Absolutely. I love talking about the early stages of career, particularly with people who are coming out of school or the early points in their professional career. When I graduated from U of I had one plan. I had to pivot quickly the summer after graduation and decided I would come up to Chicago and look for a job. I graduated in 1992. The economy was not super strong at that time, so there were not a lot of jobs. I, through a friend, was introduced to someone named Jack Kelly. He is the founding partner of a firm called McBride and Kelly. And as a favor, he interviewed me, and I was able to show him my portfolio, and he was very gracious with his time. And he said, unfortunately, we don't have any positions available, but I'm going to make some introductions. Why don't you meet with a few of these people, and if nothing pans out, call me back. So I, through that introduction, made some cold calls and basically went around the city with my portfolio and asked people to look at it with me and talk to me and give me their thoughts and advice. And all of them said, this is great. We don't really have any positions available. So to say the least, I was a little bit deflated. So I went back and I talked to Jack, and Jack said, you know what, we'll make a place for you, which really kind of changed the course of my career. I think it's one of the really amazing things about our profession, about architects, is there is a lot of mentors and sponsors that are out there that are willing to give people a chance. And I think that that's fairly unique to our profession. And so Jack gave me a job. I think I had one internship prior to that, but he took a chance on me, and he really took me under his wing and taught me a lot the first couple years. So I worked for him for a few years, and I took another opportunity with a firm called Burns & Barrell Architects, which was kind of doing a lot of high-end residential. And I worked for Gary Barrell and Steve Burns, who again were incredibly gracious and taught me a lot. And that really became the foundation that got me my job at what was then a kind of startup development company called LR Development. And again, I will tell you, that was a sort of relationship-driven opportunity where the startup development company was looking for somebody. They were kind of working on their first high-rise, high-end residential project, and they were looking for an architect that could be on staff and work with clients who were buying residential units in the building. And so they approached me about that opportunity. And through several conversations, I decided to take a leap of faith and give it a shot for a couple years, and those couple years turned into a 30-year career. So what's interesting is I think you'll find when you talk to a lot of people like me, how much of the opportunity they received early in their career came through people giving them a chance, but also how important relationships and networking are, and your willingness to forge those relationships for yourself. Me going to meet with all those firms, interestingly, several of those people I have reconnected with later in my career. So for instance, I met with Pete Landon, and he was one of the people, he has no memory of meeting with me, I'm sure, but he was very gracious with his time in that moment, and I really needed that as a recent graduate. I've reconnected with Peter later, both in sort of professional organizations, but also I've hired him for projects recently. We've had the opportunity to partner on a few jobs, and so those relationships and that networking really comes back in spades to influence your career. So I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, I definitely think that relationships is very, very important in architecture. I mean, there's just the beginning of like trying to get a job as a student. I feel like usually the people who know you, they can vouch for you. They know how good of a student, how good of a leader. They can help you get somewhere that's willing to give you a chance, because
Yes.
that's where it starts. There needs to be someone to give you a chance.
Yes.
But also networking is also important in the field in general, because you're constantly meeting with different people. You don't build a building alone. You build it with contractors and developers, clients and consultants. So there's so many people that go into that field of just having to know people, and relationships are so important. So can you talk about building business connections in the industry, especially with managing relationships with architects and engineers?
This is a great topic. The building industry is highly, highly collaborative by its nature. As you mentioned, architects don't build buildings, teams build buildings. And that has become even more apparent in my career in development. And it's part of what intrigued me about moving to the development side. As you said, it takes a lot of people, and it takes a lot of things coming together for buildings to get built. As our buildings become more complex, it requires more and more and more people to influence the design and the execution of buildings. I talk about some of these high-rise projects that we work on, but truthfully, even some of the lower-rise affordable things that we do, we often have 30 different consultants on a team that contribute to the design of a project. And so relationships, as you mentioned, are really key, not only in opening doors for you in your career, but it's the same when we're assembling a team for a project. These projects, they're long, they're complex, there's a lot of problem solving that has to happen, and you really want to work with people that you feel are like-minded and share a similar value system, and that you know will be there for you when those challenges arise. And so you do tend to build these relationships with people that you want to work with. And you do that through networking. And that might be through networking on a personal level. It might be through networking in professional organizations, through civic organizations. That's why it's so important sort of to be involved outside of your office, because that is where many of those relationships get formed. Understanding how important collaboration is critical if your goal is to have the highest sort of result or design solution in these scenarios, because it's those relationships that really form that. When we talk about relationships, it also has a lot to do with sort of how you communicate with people. And so communication skills are so important, because developing those relationships often is about the ways in which we communicate with people.
Yeah. So with relationship building, you talked about how that ended up drawing you to development. So can you talk more about what influenced your decision to move from architecture firms to development companies?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I graduated with my master's and I worked in sort of traditional practice for a handful of years. And I was approached by a kind of startup development company who was looking for an architect who wanted to work in-house with them. I was really intrigued by the company because they had this idea that if you could bring all parts of the building process under the same roof, you could deliver a better product, a richer building. And so I was super intrigued by that idea. I also knew that this company put a high value on design. And so those two things kind of intrigued me. But it was not an easy decision, and it was not a sort of singular aha moment for me. So I decided to make the move. A lot of people said, "Are you crazy? Why would you go to the dark side?" So it was a courageous decision for me to make, because I did feel like I was going against the grain a little bit. That being said, I was really intrigued by this company and what they were trying to do. And I really liked the people that were there. They were very driven. They were really passionate about what they were doing, and that sort of appealed to my personality type as well. But my idea at the time was that I would go there, I would work for them for a few years, and I would get a lot of sort of on-site experience, and I would be introduced to a whole host of clients, and I would use that experience as a springboard to starting my own firm. So that's the auspices under which I accepted that and started that opportunity. But when I arrived, within months, I was completely enamored by being on the owner side, the developer side. And it was in part because when I was working in a traditional architecture scenario, I felt like I was seeing a very small slice of the whole pie, the thing that makes buildings happen. And when I went to the owner side, all of a sudden, like this whole world opened up for me. And I was privy to conversations about partnership structures and financing and union issues and site issues and cost structures. And I was starting to see how these things influence what we're able to get built. And for me, that was an incredible wealth of experience and knowledge that I wanted to sort of understand. And I knew inherently in this environment that I would be able to learn that. And actually, probably more importantly, I wouldn't be able to learn it all. And this is something, for somebody who's really intellectually curious, it would sustain me for a long career, because I wouldn't be able to know all of that all the time. And I also understood how every project would be different, because even if we move on to another residential project, the financing structure might be different, the ownership might be different, the site logistics might be different, and that may change. I might have to respond to that as a designer. So I was very intrigued early on, and probably knew within a couple of years it was going to be a longer commitment. I also started to feel like the position that I was in, it was fairly unique, because I moved into a position where I was kind of leading architecture and design for the company. And I was leveraging in-house resources. So at one point, we had built a team of about 30 architects in-house that I was leading. But then we were also starting to assemble, and I was influencing the architects that we would hire on an external basis. And I realized that was pretty well suited to my skill set because I do believe in collaboration and relationships. And I think that my skill set as a convener really could come into play there. And this idea that I sort of could speak the language of development and I could speak the language of architecture allowed me to uniquely be a translator to each one. So in my job now, I'm often having to translate an owner's value system, our ideas about how to operate buildings, the vision we have for a particular project to the design team. But I'm also in a position to translate what the design team wants to do with their design to the development team. So this idea of me as like a convener and a translator is something that I realized I had a personal skill set that would make me pretty good at that job. And I think somebody at the IIT conversation asked, when did you know you wanted to be a developer? It wasn't that I had this hard decision one day, I'm moving from architecture to development. I would say I took an opportunity and that opportunity turned into a career. But that happened over a course of time. I mean, there was a number of decisions that I made to stay that informed that career. And I will also say something I talk to students who are coming out of school or people who are young in their profession is I think you have to be open to the possibilities. You have to be open to the things that come across your path. And I certainly could have been closed to the idea of going to development because I was very focused on being a designer, going a certain path. But I'm so grateful that I took a risk and made that leap because it turned out to be a very rewarding career in a way I could have never imagined. There's another point in my career that a lot of people don't know about. I worked for Related for about 13, 14 years, and I walked away to go work with another developer on a project in the Caribbean for 3 years. And it was a very risky decision at the time, but it was a very interesting moment for me professionally because I was at a point in my career where I sort of knew what I was doing at Related. I was very comfortable in my position, and I decided to sort of step away from that and going to an opportunity where I didn't know anything. And I had to learn how to design and build things in a completely different environment under a completely different set of concerns and criteria. And making that leap, I was lucky I got to come back to Related 3 years later, but that pause and that shift gave me an opportunity to remember that I knew how to learn. And I came back to Related sort of a much stronger leader and professional. So I think it's really important to sort of be open to the possibility of risk in your career because I think it can make your career richer as you move through.
You said it very well, like the risks, it's very scary to take a risk.
They're scary. They are scary. They were scary.
Like you don't know what's going to happen, but
Right.
I like that you talk about using that as an opportunity to learn something. I mean, what if you fail? You fail. Like you could just get back up again.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, you'll always make decisions, right? Some decisions are good, some decisions are bad. The key is to just keep moving, right? If the decision turns out like that decision to leave Related was not a good long-term decision for me, but I got out of that what I needed and it was time to move, I made the decision to move, right? And I didn't know I was going to come back to Related. That's what I ended up doing. But you're right. Sometimes you do have to have the courage to sort of shake it up a little bit. And with that, I guarantee you will learn something. It will come with good and bad, but you will always learn something.
Yeah, I agree. I think first of all, I feel like you take risks all the time in architecture, but they're usually safer risks. They're not built yet. So to be able to take a risk when something's already built, like a career, you've already built a career, some
Yes.
time, you've already built all these relationships, and to just get up and leave, I think that's pretty cool. That's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the things about development that's kind of interesting is like developers are risk takers. Architects tend not to be risk takers. And there's a lot of stuff you could talk about with that in terms of where the profession is and architects' desire to sort of mitigate risk. I also think not always, but sometimes can downplay their role in the building ecosystem. And it's something I think the profession needs to come to terms with is what is your willingness to take risk and are you willing to take a sort of subservient role because you're not willing to take risk.
Yeah, there's a lot of borders in architecture. Like sometimes you're made to do only a certain type of typology.
Yes.
And there's certain firms do these types of designs. Certain firms work with more structures. Like there's so many different types of architecture, types of buildings, and there's so many like boundaries in a way. Like they can either take risks to the extreme where they make like a really, really crazy shape and then the developer says absolutely not.
Can't
Or
do
it's
it,
the
yeah.
other way where they try to keep themselves in a box. Oh, this is what we've done for 20 years and just continuously go with that.
That's a really interesting point. And I think this goes to like a topic of, you see architects who have a really healthy command of the economics around building, and they tend to be able to navigate those two scenarios very well because they sort of understand the larger value system of the developer, the owner, and they're able to navigate that as part of their design process. And I do think sometimes when architects have less of a command, it's harder for them to navigate that. And then the things that they want to do as a designer are harder to realize because they're unable to sort of translate the value of it to the owner, to the developer. And how do you take like the experience that you've gained and you've amassed? How do you think about how to apply that in a different way?
Yeah.
And you do see architects doing this. Joe Capriel talks about this really beautifully because he's sort of had different iterations. You know, he's been a firm partner and founder. He's worked for JLL. He's had like different iterations of his career, and he talks about how that's really enriched him as a professional.
I feel like you take your risk and you just let it shape your life.
Yes.
You just go along with the flow as long as you like it.
Life is not perfect, right? Life can be a little messy sometimes. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially you can take a calculated risk, right? So even when I made the decision to go into development, I basically gave myself like a 2 or 3 year window to think about that. I had an idea about what the next step is, but when I got to that 2 or 3 years and realized I didn't want to leave, like you said, you sort of make another decision to keep moving. So the key is to really keep moving, keep making decisions, and not be afraid of if things get a little bit messy.
Yeah. Also, about your transition to development, were you already licensed at the time, or did you become licensed while you were at a development?
I was licensed. I pursued licensure pretty quickly after leaving for my master's. In part because I think a lot of the subjects that you're being tested on, the material is a little fresher when you're right out of school. So I did take the exam pretty quickly. I think I graduated in 92 and I got my license in 94 or 95.
Okay. I do want to step back and transition to the industry as a whole. You are a woman in construction.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you feel like being a woman in construction plays a role as a developer?
Yeah, it is an interesting topic for me. I feel like I've been really lucky. I started at Related really early in my career. And interestingly, there were always a lot of women on our job sites and in our company. And Related is a national company, but in the Chicago office, there's always been a lot of women. And so I don't know that within our office, I really felt that gender gap. Certainly, though, when you step out of that office, I absolutely feel that. And even to this day, while I think there's been a lot of movement, I am often in situations, in meetings where I'm the only woman in the room. And I have been lucky, like I said, in my career, not only to have other women in our office who I've sort of grown up professionally with, but I've also had really strong mentors and kind of sponsors who have helped me along the way. And some of them are women and some of them are men. And they have really helped make opportunities available to me. And I've been very fortunate in that way. But I do still see this inequity in the building industry. And I think it's true in real estate. It is true in architecture. It is true in construction. You look at the leadership of architecture firms and you don't see as many women, as many people of color as a reflection of our society. So for me, I take my responsibility pretty seriously about how do we build that? How do we reach down and bring people along with us? And we talked about relationships earlier. And I think this is where we all have a responsibility to say, how do we change that? And sometimes it's in big ways, right? It's in becoming involved in organizations that help drive that, some more diversity in our profession and in the building environment. But it's also in small ways. Like I try to really spend a lot of time and energy on mentoring young women in the profession. I try to be a good example and open doors for them as well, the same way that people open doors for me, and to show them ways in which they can become involved, make sure that I am introducing them to organizations and individuals that can help in the same way that that was done for me. So it has impacted me in as much as I see that I'm often the only woman in the room in certain scenarios, and it's impacted me in the way I try to kind of give back to the profession.
You did start to mention mentorship, and you are also involved with many organizations. So, what motivates you to continuously be part of those organizations?
Yes, I am probably continually overextended, and anyone who knows me will tell you I have a problem with no. I say yes to a lot of things, but involvement is really important to me, and it is for a few reasons. One, I will tell you, every organization that I'm involved in, actually, I have learned a lot from. And especially as I've gotten deeper into my career, it's really important that I expand the influences that I have in the ways that I learned. It's important to get out of the office. It's important to meet other people to build that network. And I have learned things. So for instance, being part of the Chicago Architecture Center and being the board chair for a few years was at a time of transition for the organization. I learned so much from that experience about how to lead during transition. So one aspect is I'm learning a lot by being involved in those organizations. I also belong to several organizations that are not architecture focused. And that is, again, deeper in my career has been very important because it allows me to interact with people from completely different sectors. There are the other aspects that I think are equally important to being involved. And I do think it's very important for architects to be civically engaged. First of all, how can you be designing for your community if you don't understand it? And being involved in these organizations really give you a much deeper understanding of what makes Chicago, Chicago. Meeting people who come from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different professions, it only enriches your understanding of what is Chicago and how do we design the best possible way for this city. So that's really important.
Actually, this goes back to what you were saying in the beginning, seeing architecture from many different scales and how it impacts different communities, seeing it from a large scale where it's the city as a whole, but also going closer and seeing it as like just a building. So what do you believe helps build a strong community, and how do you feel a home can be created, whether it's in a high rise or a neighborhood?
Yeah, this idea of community and the idea of like what is home to people is really important in the work that we do. Because as you know, we do a lot of residential work in particular. We do a lot of higher end residential, but we also do a lot of affordable housing in the city and beyond. And we do talk a lot about what does it mean for it to be a home to someone. And part of that is making people feel like they're part of a community. And I think there's a couple things that contribute to that. When we're working on these bigger scale projects, again, whether it's a larger scale affordable housing community or it's a high-rise community, you have to find places where people intersect. And you need to find those kind of common principles, or there's something called the pleasure principle, which says there are certain things that all humanity takes pleasure in. It's connection to nature, it's human interaction. And so when we're looking at these different projects, you're thinking about where are those intersections. So you'll see in all of our projects, there are certain common threads about outdoor space, connection to nature. That might be on an outdoor deck, that might be in green space. Like it takes different forms, but you think about those things that are common to all those people that they all can enjoy. You try not to get too specific. But then you also try to embed places where people intersect. Yes, we think about unit design, we think about that, but also we spend a lot of time thinking about amenity spaces. Where are people going to have moments to meet and interact, and how can we make that meaningful and successful? So again, that takes different forms and different projects, but those are two things that we do. Then the third thing that I think you have to think about is where we're building. So you want to think about the community that we're working in, and you have to understand it, because that's likely where your resident base is going to come from. And so we do spend time researching neighborhoods, researching the history of the place, so that when we're starting to design, whether it's internally or with an external design team, we have this kind of common understanding of where this is going to exist.
So I like that you talked about a home. So when bringing new development to a neighborhood, how do you incorporate culture and history of the project?
So first of all, it has to be very intentional. This has to be something that's sort of built into the culture of your company, which it certainly is related. It's something that myself and our leadership team has felt really strongly about for decades. We aren't just building buildings, we are building communities. And so when you have that kind of mindset, I think it changes the way you look at development and the way we look at how we build buildings in a community. And that can take a number of forms. As I mentioned earlier, part of it is understanding the community that you're going to be working in. And so we often spend the early days of a project trying to understand that community. And so we do things like, if I look at the 78, we spent about 9 months doing research on neighborhoods in Chicago. And if we were going to build the next great neighborhood, we first had to understand the neighborhoods that exist in Chicago. So we embarked on this process where we did a number of exercises where we visited every neighborhood in Chicago and we wrote a little white paper on each. We talked about the best in thinking around communities and housing and education and how that influences neighborhood design. So we spend a lot of time doing that. We look at the quantum campus that we're starting to develop. We spent the last 5 or 6 months on a listening tour where almost every weekend we go and meet with a different community group or organization within the community. So we can start to kind of understand what that community is all about, not only what it is today, but what it has been. And so those conversations are so important to us understanding what's appropriate to build moving forward. And then as you get into the design process, you definitely have to open up a conversation with the community, right? Like our architects, our designers will have a vision and an idea of what we want to do, but we always have to have a dialogue with the community and get their input. And that conversation always makes the development better every single time. But you have to be open to that dialogue. And then something that we've been kind of focusing on even more in the last probably 10 years is how do you involve the community in the design? And that goes back a little bit to what we talked about in terms of who do you bring into the design team. And what we want is for our projects to be built by the people in the community, but it also is helpful to have them designed by people in the community and have them have a voice in that. And so we've worked really hard, and this sort of started with some of our affordable projects many years ago, where we said there's an opportunity for us to build a workforce from local labor. And so we started reaching out into communities when we started a project, and we would host job fairs so we could understand what expertise there might be in the community that we could leverage, so that literally the project is being built by people at some level in the community. So now we're starting to talk about that on the design front as well, and how can we give opportunities to people in the community. So in our quantum computing project, we've looked at what design expertise there is in that community that we could leverage and that could help shape what we're doing. And so we're engaging with some local architects that grew up in the neighborhoods immediately adjacent, as well as artists and some landscape and graphic designers. So quite literally reaching into the community to say how could they participate as part of this project. And it's had some really meaningful results for us. So the row, which we just built in the West Loop, we partnered with an African-American contractor there, and that's the first high-rise built by an African-American contractor in the city of Chicago. Kind of hard to believe, but that comes from the intention of wanting to change the way the building industry works.
That's very cool. There's so many times that I've passed a building where I'm just like, this building does not belong here. And like something that you mentioned, even having artists, bringing in architects that grew up near there, it ends up belonging to the community. The community can take ownership of that building. And I think that that's beautiful. It's a way to bring people in, but also understand the needs of the project and respond to the needs of the people who live there.
I love the idea about talking about art and culture as it relates to the built environment. I think it is so important, and it's a kind of a personal passion of mine. It's one of the secret parts of my job that a lot of people don't know that I get to do, but I get to curate the art for all of our projects, which I love to do. And I think you're right. It's a very unique way to tie buildings to their community, whether you're engaging a local artist. Like you look at Lathrop Homes, and we commissioned a mural there under the bridge at Diversey. We also worked with another art group to create mosaics all across the property. We have another group of artists that used trees that we could not save as part of the project, and they turned them into art that exists across the site and a playground. So that's one of the ideas that I love embedding in projects that I think has this tangible day-to-day benefit to the people who live there. But again, certainly tie it back to where it exists. And that might be on an individual neighborhood basis, but it also might be in Chicago. So you look at One Bennett Park as a project that we finished years ago. But in that building, we curated this really special set of art. And one of them is a beautiful piece by Nick Cave. We really tried to employ Chicago artists so that the building itself has a reflection of who Chicago is.
I like that. It connects to a lot of what you said, especially at the very beginning when you talked about architecture and understanding like the history of architecture and how that connects to the built environment. And that's very similar to how you're talking about art, because art also changes throughout history. It also describes history. Many people, when they think of culture, they think of art. And so having buildings be able to reflect that art is very unique.
It's a really intimate experience for residents too. The building is this big expression that we bring. I think art and the way people walk by it every day, and it translates a message that people are really excited to talk about and explain to their friends and their neighbors, and it can promote dialogue also.
Yeah, and especially like Chicago is very rich in community and culture. There's so many different neighborhoods that have their own little niche.
100%. Yeah.
Yes, and there's so much artwork around. Like art changes based on neighborhood to neighborhood. And so it makes people feel home as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And Chicago's lucky in that way that we have such a rich cultural dynamic here. And you're right, we get to sort of leverage that depending on where we're working. Or we get to introduce one neighborhood to a different culture through art.
That's true. So we just talked about how art connects people to new projects that end up being built near them. So what is your experience with trying to explain what developers do for the community?
Yeah, it is interesting because along with getting questions about how I made the transition to development, I think I am also a lot of times explaining what we do and why it is intriguing to me. There are a lot of misnomers out there about developers. And I think that has a lot to do with, I think, people not always fully understanding the full weight of what developers carry as part of the building process. I often talk to architects in particular, young architects, and explain that as developers, we often carry a site for 5 or 6 years before I even pick up the phone to call an architect, because we have to sort of get a whole suite of issues aligned before we can move forward on a project. And often the developer is carrying the weight of that in-house. So what I mean by that is we might identify a site that we want to develop. And that may take a while for that to happen. We have to get under contract for the land. Then we have to sort of write a financial design that makes it feasible. We at the same time have to get the community aligned around a vision. We have to get the government, the planning department or the mayor's office or the local alderman also aligned with that vision. And crafting the sort of economics of a project that are aligned with the design vision for a project can often take years. And so we can be working on a project for, I have examples of 3 years and I have examples of 10 years where we're trying to make that alignment. And in the process, we're kind of bearing the burden of all those costs. And there are, for as many as that successfully move forward, there's those that don't. And so there's also a lot of market pressures that the developer is trying to balance. No project has an endless bucket of money that you can spend. The economics around a project are sort of formed by your ability to get financing, that is cost effective, and that's what makes the project work. And so the developers often having to play this very careful dance about how to balance all of those priorities so that a project can move forward. And as I said, there's as many that you might spend 5 years and $5 million that go sideways. And that's just money that you lose, as there are projects that move forward. So the developer really does take a huge level of risk, a huge sort of financial risk when they take on projects. And I think that a lot of certainly the general public, but also even some people in the building industry don't fully understand the weight of what they're carrying as a project moves forward. Not only their responsibility to get financing, we talk about design, but it's also the financial plan that they have to get in order. And they have to leverage relationships with equity partners and bankers and build those relationships that come to bear. And then we have to really balance all of the different stakeholders. So that might be issues around compliance or preservation or community goals or the architect's desire for design. And we have to sort of balance all of that as well. So there's a lot of things that the developer is taking on that I think sometimes not everyone understands that we're sort of carrying. And somewhere in there, we have to come up with a great solution that benefits community and is financially successful as well.
I feel like there's so much that happens with the developer. Like you even talked about it earlier, how it's the bigger picture. You see everything coming together, but you also see the beginning of everything. You guys have a site for like 5 years before anything ends up really starting with architects and design. So developers play such a big role, especially in just shaping a city. And I just think that it's really cool, and I feel like I wish people understood it a lot more.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Not everything is perfect all the time. Just like there are architects that do great work and maybe architects who do average work, there are developers that do great work. I mean, it exists in every profession. But I hope that we are moving away from the idea that the developers are kind of the dark side of the building industry and that we really play kind of a vital role in moving projects forward. Because I think when there is that mutual respect, I think we can work in partnership to deliver better projects.
I agree. You said it very well. But I appreciate you having on this podcast. We have a few more questions. So while we close up, I would like to ask, would you be able to give some advice to young designers who might want to make an impact, even if it's outside the traditional architectural pathway?
Sure. I think there's a lot of motivations in our industry for what we do and how we do it. And the desire to make an impact, I think, is common to all of us as designers. And it certainly has been something that I've carried with me through the course of my career. Even when I've made probably what seem like unorthodox decisions, it's really often grounded in this idea I want to find a way to make impact in the built environment. And that often has to be a really personal fire that you carry. Our job is often not easy, right? Whether you're in the development world, in construction, in architecture, this is a really, really tough industry. And there are days where it's about getting the work done. And the desire to create impact often is that part where you do more, where you push a little harder, where you carry that fire and say, what more could I do? Everyone in the building industry works really long hours. These are complicated, hard projects to bring forward. A real commitment of time and energy to say, I'm not just going to get it done. There are days when you just have to get it done, but you always have to be thinking about what could I do more? Where can I see the opportunity? How do I look at not just the building, but the areas around the building? How do I look to ways to reach out to a community? That often has to be something that I think you carry internally, and you're looking for those opportunities. But there are days when it's not all about magic, and it is about putting the hard work in. I encourage everyone to find that thing that personally motivates them to make a difference, and you carry that with you in everything that you do, and you look for every opportunity that you can find to make a difference. And take risks. Yes, take risks. Do the unexpected.
But thank you for the advice. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening will appreciate that, but also even just understanding the role of developers and how they shape the built environment was very helpful to learn. So the hardest question, what are your future plans and goals?
It's interesting. They're probably not that different than what they were when I first started in architecture. I have built a certain level of experience and expertise just by working on a number of projects. And similar to how I thought when I first started, is I would like to take that experience and expertise and continue to find ways to use it to have impact, to build better projects, to influence and enrich the communities that we build in. That has never changed for me. But I'd also like to sort of be a champion of this idea of the building process being collaborative, that this integrated approach to building is fundamental to doing great projects. And I want to be a champion for that. And then, of course, I want to be a champion for building more diversity in our profession, whether it's mentoring women who are coming up in the profession to be leaders or people of color to make sure that our profession reflects the diversity of our communities. And I think that makes not only our profession more interesting and richer, but our communities richer. So it's funny that when we talk about that fire that you have to carry, I think there are things that you learn about yourself, that you learn about the built environment when you are in school. And I think it's important to sort of keep those as you move through. And there will be different ways that you'll use that to influence what you do and how you do it. But I think it's really important to keep that desire to do great design in whatever pathway that you find that, right? Architects are finding numerous ways to be involved in the building industry. And I think that's fascinating, right? Like traditional architecture is one way, and it might be the biggest way that architects are influencing the built environment. But you're also seeing architects in policy and government. You're seeing them as project managers and general contractors. And the ways in which we influence the built environment is becoming more varied, and I think that's a super exciting time. And so I want to encourage that and encourage architects to take the way they think, the way they problem solve, and apply that in as many ways as they can. So as I look at the next chapters in my career, it's still this fundamental desire to really build great projects that enrich our community.
I'm looking forward to see all these build projects.
Me too. I suppose I should say right now we're working on what I think will be real legacy projects for Chicago, whether it's 400 Lakeshore Drive or the 78 or the Quantum Campus down at the old U.S. Steel site. And I'm really excited about sort of bringing to bear all of our experience and expertise and see those to fruition, because I think they have the opportunity to be really transformational. And I have a lot of partners that I've worked with for decades, and I think those projects are possible for us because of the ways we've worked together and built this kind of combined experience. So it's a really exciting time for me and for all of us to be able to bring those projects forward.
I agree. I really appreciate you being on the show. Not only did I learn a lot about developers and understanding like different relationships that come into the built environment, but I also learned a lot about you as well and like what motivates you and why you do the work that you do. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone who's listening. We release our episodes monthly. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us on Instagram at beyondthesurface_NOMAS IIT. I want to thank our producer, Kayla Kwok, and the NOMAS IIT team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Surface featuring Ann Thompson. Until next time, goodbye.